Noah Sloan had fished Trace Fork Creek his whole life, and he knew what the water carried. After rain, after the creek swelled and pushed hard against its banks and ran the color of weak coffee, it gave things up. Fence posts, feed sacks, the occasional carcass of something small that had miscalculated the current. He knew what the water carried because he'd been pulling things off his trot line since before the war, down on the lower bend where the creek slowed against a limestone shelf, and anything floating would eventually catch. He knew the creek. He thought he knew it. April of 1961. He was down at the trot line before first light, his breath showing. The creek running about a foot over its normal line from 3 days of steady rain. The mud on the bank had that mineral bite to it, that wet stone smell that April creeks carry in the mountains, cold and dark and alive. He moved the lantern along the line, checking hooks. Most were empty. Catfish won't feed hard in floodwater. He was almost done when he saw it snagged on an exposed root about 4 feet out. A pale shape against the dark water, caught and turning slowly in the current. He thought it was a rag. The creek carried rags. He waded out to his shins, the cold water hitting him like a slap through his boots, and he reached for it. It wasn't a rag, it was a doll. Hand-sewn cotton body, a dress made from fabric, printed with a tiny blue flower pattern. Button eyes, real buttons, black, 4-hole, the kind his grandmother had kept in a tin on her windowsill. The doll was maybe 10 inches long. He held it up in the lantern light and turned it over in his hands. The outside was damp the way anything pulled from floodwater is damp. But when he pressed his thumb into the seam along the doll's back, where the cotton panels had been stitched together with small, careful stitches, the fabric inside was dry, not damp, not slightly moist, dry, like it had been sitting in a cedar chest in a warm room, not riding 3 days of floodwater down 14 miles a creek. He stood in the shallows, with that doll in his hands for a long time. I was on the bank at dawn checking my trot line, he said later. The creek was up from rain. I saw it caught on a root. Thought it was a rag. Pulled it out. It was a doll. Hand-sewn. Cotton dress, button eyes. Not a speck of rot. The fabric was dry inside the seams. I held a doll that had been in floodwater, and it was dry. That's when I knew something was wrong with this creek. He took it home. He set it on the kitchen table. Dinah came in from the back room, walking with that familiar leftward tilt she'd carried since she was 7 years old, the year she'd fallen out of a walnut tree and landed wrong on her hip. And she stood in the doorway, looking at the doll on the table for a moment without saying anything. Then she said, "Where'd you find that?" "Trotline bend." She crossed the kitchen and picked up the doll and pressed its seams, same as he had. She set it back down carefully. She looked at him. "This is old," she said. "I know it." She looked at the doll for another moment. Then she looked at the window, at the dark outside, at the sound of the creek audible from here when the water was up, a low, constant rush, like breath. "Put it somewhere I don't have to look at it," she said, and went back to the other room. He put it in the barn. He didn't know yet that it was only the first. Floyd County, Kentucky. You need to see it before we go any further. Not see it, feel it, because seeing doesn't quite get there. This is mountain country, not the dramatic peaks and valleys mountain country that ends up on postcards, but the close, folded, forested kind, ridges running parallel and tight, hollows between them so narrow that direct sunlight only hits the creek bottom for a few hours a day. The hollows have names: Cow Creek Hollow, Greasy Branch, Mud Lick, Martin's Fork. The names are old and they're practical, and they tell you exactly who gave them. People who lived by what they called things. People who needed the names to mean something before they'd use them. Trace Fork Creek is one of the smaller tributaries, 14 miles from its headwaters in the mountains southeast of Prestonsburg, down to where it runs into a larger branch. 14 miles through heavy second-growth timber, through country that was logged in the early 1900s and left alone since. Left to close, back up over itself, the way Appalachian forest does, fast and thorough, until you wouldn't know there'd ever been a tree cut there if you didn't know to look. The creek runs shallow over limestone and shale, 6 to 8 feet wide in most places, and in a normal year, it floods maybe twice. Once in spring snowmelt, once if the fall rains come heavy. When it floods, it carries. It deposits along its banks and in the quieter water, behind rocks and roots, and when it recedes, it leaves behind whatever it carried. Normal things. The kind of things creeks carry. Noah had lived on Trace Fork his entire 55 years, in the house his father had built and his grandfather had helped with, on the lower stretch where the creek ran close enough that you could hear it from the porch. He knew its moods. He knew that the limestone shelf at the trot line bend caught debris, knew which parts of the bank eroded each spring and which held, knew the smell of the creek at different water levels, how low summer water smelled of algae and sun-warmed rock, how flood water smelled of the forest floor, of everything the rain had pulled loose and sent downstream. He knew this creek. The doll he could not explain. He was not a man who talked himself out of things he'd observed with his own hands. He'd felt the dry seam. He knew what he'd felt. And so he took the doll to Ephraim Newsom in June, when Newsom came up from Pikeville on his summer rounds. Because Newsom made rounds, that was the right word for it, making his way through the county, buying things from people who didn't know what they had or did know and needed the money anyway. Newsom taught American history at Pikeville College, which gave him just enough academic standing to be credible and just enough disposable income to be dangerous in the presence of old things. He was 43 that summer, bald as a new moon, with a habit of holding objects up to the light and rotating them slowly while he talked about something entirely else, as if his hands and his mind were on separate schedules. He had a particular walk, quick, slightly forward-leaning, like a man perpetually late for a lecture he was genuinely excited to give. He bought mountain antiques not to sell, but to keep, and his small house in Pikeville was crowded with the evidence: corner cupboards, butter molds, crockery, tinware, the accumulated objects of 3 centuries of Appalachian domestic life arranged without any particular system except that Newsom knew where everything was. Noah drove down to see him with the doll wrapped in a flour sack on the seat beside him. Newsom unwrapped it at his kitchen table, set it under his lamp, and went quiet for a while. He pressed the seams, the same as Noah, the same as Dinah. He looked at the fabric. He got out a magnifying glass and looked at the stitching. He looked at the buttons. "Where did you say you found this?" he said. Not a question exactly, more like a man confirming a calculation. "Trotline bend, down off the floodwater." Newsom looked at him over the magnifying glass. Noah, this doll is from the 1840s, maybe earlier. The fabric is pre-Civil War cotton, the kind of small floral print they produced in the 1840s. The buttons are a type that stopped being made after about 1855. This is a real object, an old object, and it is in extraordinary condition. He set the magnifying glass down. It should not be in extraordinary condition. Cotton from the 1840s in floodwater should be in pieces. This fabric is intact. The stitching is intact. The seam was dry. Newsom looked at him. You said, not damp, dry. Newsom looked at the doll. He picked it up and held it to the light, rotating it slowly, and he did not say anything for a long moment. Come back if you find another one, he said. The second object came down in August. The summer had been dry. Trace Fork had run low and slow, the water clear enough to see the shale bottom, and Noah had nearly convinced himself that the doll was an anomaly, some freak of preservation and luck, a thing that had lodged in a hollow bank somewhere upstream for 100 years and finally been knocked loose. He could live with that. The creek gave up old things sometimes. That happened. Then the August rains came. 4 days, steady and heavy, and Trace Fork came up fast, over the limestone shelf, over the root where the doll had snagged, up the low bank to within 6 feet of his property line. On the 5th morning, when the creek had dropped back to about a foot above normal, Noah walked the lower bank the way he always did after a flood, checking the trot line, looking at the deposits. The usual, a plastic jug from somewhere upstream, a section of fence rail, leaves, packed into the lee of every rock, and on the gravel bar past the trot line bend, where the creek left its heaviest debris, a Bible. Leather cover, black, swollen a little on the outside, but not cracked. He picked it up. It was heavy in a satisfying way, a well-made book, not a cheap one. He opened it. The inside pages were dry, not protected dry, not just dried out, but simply dry, the way a book is dry when it lives on a shelf, in a room with a wood stove. The pages opened cleanly. There was an inscription on the inside front cover, written in a careful, unhurried hand that had pressed a little too hard on the downstrokes. To Emmett and Clara Caudle on the occasion of their marriage. May God keep you in His sight and in His grace. February 14th, 1872. He stood on the gravel bar holding that Bible with the creek running past him and the smell of flood water in the air. Mineral, cold, the specific sharpness of water that has traveled fast over wet stone. And he turned the pages. Family records in the back, the kind that Bibles had, with the births and deaths written in a column. Emmett Caudle, born 1848. Clara Caudle, born 1851. 3 children listed with birth years: 1873, 1875, 1878. Then the column stopped. No death dates, no notes. Just names and years, and then silence, as if the person writing had set down the pen intending to come back, and simply hadn't. He brought the Bible home and put it in the barn next to the doll. That evening Dinah came out to look at it. She stood in the barn doorway, not coming in, reading the inscription from where she stood. The light was going and Noah held the lantern while she read. "Caudle," she said. "You know any Caudles on the Upper Fork?" "Not living, maybe once." Dinah looked at the Bible. She looked at the doll on the shelf beside it. She looked at Noah. Her expression was the expression she used when she was keeping something in until she had the right words for it. "You put those back," she said. "You hear me? You put everyone back. They're just, you put them back, Noah. He didn't put them back. He brought Newsom up in September. They sat at the kitchen table, and Newsom went through the Bible the same way he'd gone through the doll. Methodical, careful, that private internal quality of concentration that looked from the outside like boredom, but was the opposite. He dated the leather to the 1860s to 70s, the paper to the same period. The ink in the inscription was iron gall, standard for the era. The inscription itself, the handwriting, the pressure, the formation of the letters, all consistent with a person who had learned to write in the 1850s or 1860s in this region. You understand what I'm saying to you, Newsom said, that it's old, that it's real. I buy a lot of old things, Noah. Some of them turn out to be fakes or later reproductions or objects that got wet once and dried badly and aged strangely. This is none of those things. This is an 1872 family Bible from this county, genuine. And it is in the same condition it was in the day it was given to Emmett and Clara Caudle. He paused. And you pulled it out of Trace Fork after a flood? Yes. No, that's what I'm saying. That cannot be what happened. A Bible in flood water for any amount of time wouldn't look like this. Even well-oiled leather wouldn't survive immersion. The pages would be destroyed. He set the Bible down, which means either this Bible was not in the water, it was deposited at the bank's edge by the flood without being submerged somehow, which is possible but unlikely, or something is wrong with my understanding of what's happening here. He stayed for supper. After, on the porch, listening to the creek, he said, "Is there anything upstream? Old structures, old sites?" "Nothing," Noah said. "Forest. Nothing but forest up there." "How far have you been?" "I've fished up to about 8 miles, same above, forest." Newsom looked at the dark, where the creek was. "I want to see the next one when it comes," he said. He didn't have to wait long. October. Third flood of the year, harder than the August rain, driven by a nor'easter that had come up through Virginia and lost half its strength before it hit eastern Kentucky, but still delivered 2 inches in 24 hours. The creek went up over the limestone shelf, over the bank, and Noah stood on the porch at 3 in the morning and listened to it. That particular low thunder of flood water, heavier and more deliberate than rain, the sound of the creek deciding it was going somewhere no matter what was in its way. By morning it had dropped back. He walked the bank. The spectacles were caught in a willow's exposed roots right at the waterline. Wire frames, small round lenses, the kind of eyeglasses that people wore in the early decades of the century. He held them up to the sky. The lenses were thick at the center and thin at the edges. Significant correction, a person who couldn't see much without them. He took them to Newsom the next morning. Newsom spent a long time on those spectacles. He drove to Lexington with them the following week and showed them to an optometrist he knew, a man who had a particular interest in the history of lens grinding. That man spent 2 days with them before calling Newsom with his conclusion. The lenses were hand ground, not machine made, hand ground, which was how prescription lenses were made before the mid-1900s industrialization of optical manufacturing. The grind was consistent with work done between 1900 and 1920. There was no manufacturer's mark anywhere on the frames or lenses. In the first 2 decades of the century, small regional opticians sometimes worked without marking their products, and this appeared to be such a case. But there was no record of a licensed optician working in the upper Floyd County area in that period. The closest optical shop would have been in Prestonsburg. Someone ground these by hand, Newsom told Noah over the telephone. Someone who knew what they were doing, and whoever wore them had a significant astigmatism in the left eye. The spectacles went on the barn shelf next to the doll and the Bible. Newsom drove up again the following Saturday, and they sat in the kitchen while rain fell outside and the creek rose, and Newsom spread out a piece of paper he'd been working on. A list. Objects. Doll, approximately 1840s. Bible, 1872. Spectacles, approximately 1900 to 1920. Condition, all exceptional. Origin, Trace Fork Creek floodwater. He underlined the dates. These objects span 80 years, he said. They're in mint condition. Nothing in a creek stays mint for a year, let alone a century. He tapped the paper, and none of this makes sense unless the objects were not in the water for any significant period of time, which means either they've been stored somewhere upstream, somewhere dry and sealed, and the floods are releasing them, or... He stopped. Or what? Noah said. Newsom folded the paper. I don't know what the or is, he said. Not yet. Outside, the rain kept falling. The creek rose. They could hear it from the kitchen, closer than usual, heavier, that floor-level rumble that a flood creek makes when it's truly up. On the counter, the coffee pot sent up a thin curl of steam. The kitchen smelled of that and of wood smoke, and of the cedar plank Noah had laid across the door gap to keep the cold out. That pale, dry smell of old wood. Dinah moved around behind them, refilling cups, not joining the conversation, not interrupting it. But when Newsom said he'd like to bring up a colleague, another historian, someone who knew the history of the upper watershed, she set down the coffee pot. He already has too many of those things in the barn, she said. Newsom looked at her. Mrs. Sloane. The creek's giving back what it took, she said. Her voice was level. That means it took it from somebody, and what you're doing is taking it from the creek before it gets to where it's going. She picked up the coffee pot. That's what I have to say about it. She went back to the other room. Newsom looked at Noah. Noah looked at his coffee cup. She's right about most things, Noah said. I believe it, Newsom said. He brought the colleague anyway. The carved wooden spoon came down in November. Tulip wood smoothed by long use, the handle worn to a particular curve that matched the grip of a right hand. You could feel the wear when you held it, the hollow where the thumb would have pressed. No decoration except a small notch near the base of the handle, the kind of mark a person puts on their things so they know them from other people's things. Clean. Warm inside the grain, warmer than it had a right to be. The child's shoe came down in December, a week before Christmas. Leather, small, a child of about 4 years old, Newsom judged. Lace up, the kind common from the 1880s through the early 1900s. The right shoe only. The sole was barely worn. A child who had not done much walking in these shoes, or had worn them on good occasions. The leather was supple. It smelled of the tallow that someone had rubbed into it to keep it sound, and that smell came through the cold water smell as clear as anything. Animal fat and preservation, the smell of someone caring for a thing. Noah held that shoe for a long time before he put it on the barn shelf. The mason jar came in February, sealed with beeswax, the wax still intact, the seal unbroken. Inside, through the cloudy glass, dried herbs. When Newsom eventually had them analyzed, He drove to a botanist at Morehead State. They came back as a blend of dried mint, boneset, and something that might have been wild ginger or a close relative. A medicinal preparation, probably. The kind of thing a family kept on hand before there was a doctor within a day's drive. The beeswax seal was perfect. By February of 1962, Newsom had the timeline spread across 3 sheets of paper. Doll. Approximately 1840 to 1855. Bible. 1872. Confirmed. Spectacles. 1900 to 1920. Spoon. Undatable precisely, but consistent with late 1800s to early 1900s manufacture. Shoe. Consistent with 1880s to 1910s. Mason jar. Mason jars began production in 1858. The specific jar style dated to roughly 1880 to 1910. He sat in Noah's kitchen with those 3 sheets of paper and he said, "These objects span 120 years, the earliest from the 1840s and the latest from some time in the first 2 decades of the 1900s. They're all in mint condition." He paused. He looked at Noah across the table, his bald head catching the window light from the south. "What was up there? Before the logging? What was upstream?" "I don't know," Noah said. "There's nobody to ask." He thought for a moment. "Liddy Prater?" Newsom looked up. "Who?" "Liddy Prater. Lives up the road past the Caudle branch. She's old. Her family's been here since, I don't know how long, since always." "How old is she?" Noah thought. 80, maybe older. He reached for the coffee pot. "She knows things." They went to see Liddy Prater on a cold Tuesday in March, when the ground was still half frozen and the creek was running fast and dark from snowmelt. Her house was a white frame house on a small bench above the road, with a porch that needed painting and a garden that didn't. Because gardens in that part of the world get tended before houses do. She was sitting in a rocker on that porch when they pulled up in a heavy coat and a wool hat, watching the creek down below the road with the focused attention of someone who watches moving water the way other people watch television. She was small. She had a face that had been settling into itself for a long time and had arrived at something final. Not old in the way of decline, but old in the way of completion, like a piece of wood that has been planed and sanded until it's exactly what it is. Her hands in her lap were knotted and still. They came up the porch steps, and she looked at them without surprise, as if she'd been expecting visitors or had simply stopped being surprised by anything years ago. Noah introduced Newsom. Newsom shook her hand carefully. He'd brought the Bible wrapped in cloth, and he showed it to her and told her where it had come from. She held it in her lap without opening it and looked at the cover for a moment. "Caudle," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "There were caudles up the fork," she said. Her voice was slow, each word set down like a stone. "Before my time, but my grandmother spoke of them. 3-4 families up there, up above the headwater bend. Good families. They came in before the war. Before the first war, I mean. Before the war between the states." She handed the Bible back to Newsom. "They're gone." "When did they leave?" Newsom asked. She looked at the creek. 1879, she said, thereabouts. Something in Newsom went still. "What happened in 1879? "Flood," she said. She said it the way she'd say rain or road. Simple, practical, a thing that happens. Spring flood, the kind this country gets every generation or so. Creek came up all the way to the ridge on both sides. Silt flow. Not just water, silt. When it drained, the whole holler was filled in. The hollow above the headwater bend, the one where those families had lived. It was just gone. Creek silt, 10, 12 feet deep in places, buried everything. Newsom was very still. The families evacuated, she said it simply. They got out. Creek gave them warning. It does, when it's going to really come up. It gets a sound first. They got out. But everything they owned, everything they'd built, the cabins, the barns, the gardens, the outbuildings, all of it went under the silt. She rocked once, slowly. They said the creek took everything but the people. A bird called somewhere in the trees below the road. The creek ran below that. The afternoon light was thin and direct, the kind of mountain march light that doesn't warm anything but shows everything clearly. Noah said, "So, the objects, the things we've been finding in the creek, those could be from that settlement, coming up after 80 years as the creek erodes the silt." Liddy looked at him. "Could be," she said. "That would explain the preservation. Sealed in silt, dry inside the silt pack." "Could be," she said again. Her tone hadn't changed, but something in it had shifted. A slight additional weight or the absence of one. She was watching the creek again. Newsom said carefully, "Mrs. Prider, if the settlement was buried in 1879, if those families left in 1879, the objects we're finding span from the 1840s to the early 1900s. At least some of them are from decades after the silt flood." The rocker moved once. The porch board settled. "Yes," she said, "that means either some of these objects were in the hollow after 1879, which would require someone living there after the silt flood in a buried settlement, or, she said quietly. He waited. She looked at the creek. "My grandmother said that the people who came back to the Upper Fork, not those families, they were gone, other people maybe 10 years after, said the hollow sounded like it had people in it." She paused. "Not sounds of people, like the hollow itself had. A weight to it, a presence." She turned and looked at Newsom directly for the first time. She said it felt occupied. The creek ran below them. The bird called again, further away now. Newsom held the wrapped Bible in his hands and said nothing. Liddy looked back at the water. "There were families up there," she said. 3, 4 families. Creek came up one spring and they were gone. Not the families, the whole holler. Silt covered everything. She paused. The creek buried them. She meant the possessions, the buildings. She meant the physical life of those families preserved under silt. That was the rational reading. Neither Noah nor Newsom said it. Newsom drove back to Pikeville that evening, and Noah sat in the kitchen after supper and thought. The doll from the 1840s. The families had been in the Upper Hollow since at least the early 1840s, Liddy's grandmother had said. That fit. The Bible from 1872. The settlement still existed then, 7 years before the silt flood. That fit. The spectacles from 1900 to 1920. The settlement did not exist then. It had been under 10 feet of silt since 1879. The shoe, the spoon, the mason jar, all consistent with a period after the burial. He sat with that for a long time. There were 2 ways to think about it. The first was that the objects weren't all from the buried settlement. Some were from other sources upstream, other debris deposited over the years in the same creek system, and the creek was simply mixing them together and delivering them all to his trotline bend. That was the reasonable reading. It required only that there had been other people, other structures, other lives lost in that watershed over the decades, which was not unreasonable, not in a country where people lived in isolated hollows without any official record. The second way to think about it was the way Dinah had been thinking about it since the first morning. He didn't want to think about it the second way. He went to the barn. He stood in front of the shelf with the objects arranged on it: the doll, the Bible, the spectacles, the spoon, the shoe, the sealed jar. And he looked at them. The barn smelled of hay and oil and old wood, and the specific cold, clean smell of nighttime in early spring, the smell that came in through the gaps in the boards. A car passed on the road somewhere distant, its headlights sweeping across the barn ceiling through the knotholes, and then it was gone and dark again. He picked up the shoe. It was warm in his hand. He told himself it was residual warmth from where Newsom had held it earlier. He put it back down. The jar of dried herbs was still sealed. He picked it up and held it to the lantern. The herbs inside were still green, not fresh, not living, but not the dead brown they should have been after a century in silt. Dried green, the color of things carefully preserved. The mint was identifiable even through the glass. He unscrewed the lantern's heat shield and held the jar close, trying to see better. And from inside the jar, through the glass and the beeswax seal and the dried herbs, came a smell. Faint, very faint. Almost certainly his imagination. But it was there. The smell of mint and dried ginger. The smell of something that had been put up carefully in a warm kitchen 100 years ago, reaching him through the glass, through the dark, through the cold barn air. He set the jar down. He didn't sleep well that spring. Randall Hall came into this in the fall of 1962, the way 17-year-old boys come into things. Sideways, with more confidence than judgment, and with a kayak his uncle had not given him permission to borrow. He was Noah's sister's boy, the younger of two, and he had grown up partly on Trace Fork, visiting his uncle during summers and holidays since he was small. He was long-armed, sun-darkened, with a second toe longer than his first on both feet that made him walk with a slightly deliberate placement, like a man always testing his footing. He'd been kayaking the local creeks since he was 14, and he was good at it. Light on the water, patient in the technical sections, with the particular stillness in fast water that you either have or you don't. He knew about the objects. He'd seen them in the barn. He'd heard the conversations, not all of them, but enough. And the way he saw it was that there was one simple answer to all of this that nobody had tried. And the answer was, go upstream. He said as much to Noah in August. "I've been up there," Noah said. "How far?" 8 miles, maybe 9. Creek's 14 miles to the headwaters. Randall looked at him. "Nobody's been to the top. There's nothing at the top, it's forest." "Then there's nothing at the top," Randall said. "But at least we'll know." Noah said no. This was not a conversation Noah wanted to have, which Randall registered and noted and filed under things to think about later. He waited until early October when Noah had driven to Pikeville to see Newsom about the 7th object, a small tin cup, dented with a stamped design of a bird on the bottom. And Randall borrowed the kayak from the barn and put it in the creek at the lower bend and started upstream. The first 6 miles were familiar. He'd fished this section with Noah plenty of times. The wide limestone shelves, the long pools, the quick rocky drops where the creek narrowed. The forest was second-growth oak and maple, the leaves at peak color, red and orange against the sky, the ground below them deep in fallen leaves that sent up a sweet, fermented smell when he dragged the kayak over a shoal. The water was low for October, clear, cold when he tested it with his hand. At mile 6, the character of the creek changed. It didn't change dramatically. No particular landmark, no visible reason. But the water color deepened slightly, going from the pale tan of limestone-filtered creek to something a shade darker, the color of very weak tea. The bottom was no longer pure shale. Silt had come in. Not unusual for upstream sections, but it was more present here, silting in the quiet pools behind rocks and in the inside bends of the channel. He paddled through it. Mile 7, 8. The forest closed in tighter here, the ridges on either side higher and more immediate, the hollow narrower. The light that came through was filtered twice, once by the ridge height and once by the canopy, so that everything had a particular underwater quality, green and diffuse. He could smell the forest floor more strongly here, that deep, wet leaves smell of October in a hollow that doesn't get much sun. And under it, or maybe it was just the silt stirred up by his paddling, a different smell, older, mineral and still. The smell of something that had been enclosed for a long time. Mile 9. The silt was deeper. He could see it now in the slower sections. The creek bottom not shale, but a thick layer of fine gray-brown silt. The surface of it rippled by the current into small, regular patterns. He dragged the kayak over a fallen log and put it back in and continued. Mile 10. The creek bent hard left around a limestone outcrop, and when he came around the bend, he stopped paddling and let the kayak drift. The creek bed ahead was different. He stared. He let the kayak drift sideways in the slow current, and he stared. And then he reached for the gunwale and held himself in place and looked more carefully. The silt was 6 to 8 feet deep in the pools ahead. He could tell the depth because he could see the objects embedded in it at various depths, visible through the clear water, the way things are visible through clear water, slightly distorted, slightly magnified, but undeniably present. On the left bank side of the creek bed where a large pool had formed in the lee of the limestone outcrop, plates, 3 ceramic plates, the white kind with a blue pattern, sitting in the silt at what looked like 18 inches deep. Sitting, not lying. Set in the silt as if placed on a table upright in the position plates occupy when they are put away in a cupboard or stacked on a shelf, but horizontal, held that way by the surrounding silt. The silt packed around them so closely that they maintained their position even though there was no shelf, nothing to hold them. He looked further. Beyond the plates, deeper in the pool, darker, the shape of a chair, a rocking chair. The wood was dark with age and water and silt, but the shape was unmistakable. The curved runners, the back slats, the arms, sitting upright in the silt at what looked like 4 or 5 feet depth, upright as if someone had just gotten out of it, its position maintained by the surrounding silt, the way the plates' positions were maintained. He made himself breathe. He paddled slowly forward, barely disturbing the water. The pool widened and deepened, and the objects in the silt multiplied. Tools. He saw the shape of an axe head at about 3 feet depth, and beside it, what might have been a maul or a hammer, and beside that a row of smaller objects he couldn't identify from this angle. They were arranged, not in the way that things settle when they fall, not scattered, not toppled. They were arranged along what would have been a shelf at the height of about 3 feet above the original ground surface, still holding that height, still holding that order, the silt having preserved not just the objects, but their placement, as if the contents of a room had been frozen in place, mid-arrangement, at the moment the silt came in. He drifted over the pool. Below him, through 5 feet of clear water, was a table. He could see it because of its shape, a rectangular darkness at the creek bottom, the edges straight in the way that no natural thing is straight. And on the table, still in position as if someone had just finished setting it, 3 cups, a small pitcher, a cloth, or what had been a cloth, reduced now to a dark outline in the silt, its shape maintained by the silt that had packed around it while it still held its original form. He was breathing hard. He paddled very slowly through the pool, not speaking, barely moving, watching the creek bed. Further ahead, the pool shallowed and the silt thinned, and the objects became harder to see. But they continued. More tools, the shape of what might have been a loom or a large frame. More plates, more cups. The impression of fabric, multiple times. He could see the outlines of what might have been clothing, folded shapes preserved in silt, the fabric itself gone, but its shape remaining in the fine particulate that had packed around it. A ghost household in the creek bed, perfectly frozen, perfectly placed, waiting. He told himself, erosion did this. The silt flood of 1879 came in fast, and fast silt preserves position. He'd read this somewhere or heard it, or it just made sense the way things sometimes make sense at the exact wrong moment. The silt came in and buried everything in place before it could fall or shift or scatter. The objects were where they'd been left when the family evacuated, positioned where they'd been positioned in the last minutes before the water came, and the silt had enclosed them like plaster of Paris, like a mold, like amber. 80 years had preserved what no museum could have. This was what Newsom needed to see. This was the explanation for the objects in the creek. Erosion was slowly releasing them from the outer edges of the buried hollow, peeling back the silt year by year, freeing them into the current. That was what he told himself. Then he noticed the water temperature. He had his hand trailing in the current, the way he did when he was moving slowly and not focused on paddling, and he became aware that the water was warmer. Not dramatically, not hot, not even comfortably warm, but measurably warmer than the water he'd been in for the past 4 hours of paddling. October Creek water in the mountains runs between 45 and 55 degrees. This was closer to 60. He moved his hand experimentally, lifted it to the surface, dropped it back. Warmer at depth, warmer near the silt bed. He sat with that for a moment. Then, below his kayak, the silt moved. Not the objects, the silt itself. A slow, deep vibration. The kind you feel in your chest before you hear it. The kind that comes up through a structure before the structure shakes. It moved through the kayak hull and into his hands and up his arms and settled in his chest like a second heartbeat. Not violent, nothing violent here. Slow and deep and rhythmic. He sat very still and felt it. He looked down through the water at the table and the cups and the pitcher, all of them trembling faintly in the hum, all of them slightly out of focus in the disturbed water, all of them still in their places, still arranged, still waiting. He was not afraid. He would tell Noah and Newsom later, carefully, that he hadn't been afraid. And he'd be telling the truth, which was somehow the most unsettling part, because what he'd felt was not fear, but something closer to recognition. The feeling of arriving somewhere that had been expecting you. The feeling of a door opened from the inside. He did not reach for any of the objects. He had almost reached for the plate. He'd leaned forward, his hand over the water, and he'd stopped. He didn't know what stopped him. The hum, maybe, the warmth, the recognition. He held his hand over the water for a moment, and then he drew it back. He turned the kayak around. He paddled downstream, faster now, and behind him the creek narrowed and the objects in the silt receded into the murky dark of the deep pools. And after a mile or so, the water temperature dropped back to normal and the hum in the hull faded and was gone. The forest was loud around him, wind in the October leaves, the creek over rocks, a crow somewhere high on the ridge. Ordinary sounds. The sounds of a hollow that was just a hollow, just water and trees and afternoon light. He took nothing. He told Noah that night, at the kitchen table with Dinah in the other room and the creek audible from the porch, where it ran 12 miles from whatever Randall had found. He told it straight, the plates, the chair, the table setting, the tools, the arrangement, the warmth, the hum. Noah listened without moving. His coffee cup was between his hands and he did not lift it. When Randall finished, Noah said, "The objects in my barn, the doll, the Bible, those things, they came from there." "Yes, sir." "The silt is releasing them." "That's what it looks like." "But the objects go up to 1920. The silt flood was 1879. The settlement was buried in 1879. The settlement couldn't have produced objects from 1900. Randall looked at him. "No, sir." They sat with that. Dinah appeared in the kitchen doorway. She had her arms crossed against the cold. The stove was low, and she looked at both of them. "Did you take anything?" she asked Randall. "No, ma'am." She looked at him for a long moment, reading something in his face. Then she looked at Noah. "Good," she said, and went back to the other room. Newsom drove up 4 days later, when Randall's report reached him. He sat at the same table and heard the same account, and his response was to say nothing for a very long time, and then to say, "I need to see this." "You can't get there," Randall said. "Not without a kayak. It's technical in the upper section. I'll learn." "Professor Newsom," Randall said gently, "you really won't." Newsom pulled out his sheets of paper, the timeline, the objects. He spread them on the table and looked at them and then at Randall. The objects span 1840 to 1920. The settlement was buried in 1879. The silt preserved everything in its placed position. You saw that. Plates on a shelf, tools in arrangement, a table set. He tapped the paper. Now, erosion is releasing the objects from the outer silt layers into the current. That's the mechanism. That's how they reach Noah's trotline bend. He paused. But that only explains how they're released. It doesn't explain why the objects postdate the burial. It doesn't explain the warm water. It doesn't explain... He stopped. "The hum?" Randall said. "I wasn't going to say that," Newsom said. "But it explains that too," Randall said. "Or it doesn't explain it. It's the same thing." Newsom folded his papers. He looked at Noah. "What do you know about the hollow, about the families who lived there?" "Just what Liddy said. 3 or 4 families. They got out when the flood came." "They got out," Newsom said slowly. "The people got out." He set the papers down. The household got out too, he said, just not in any direction we can follow. Nobody answered that. The creek moved outside the window. The leaves on the maple in the yard shifted in a small wind. The coffee pot sent up its thin steam. 4 people in a kitchen in Floyd County, Kentucky, in October of 1962, and none of them said the thing they were all thinking, because there was no language for it that didn't sound like madness. And because the thing they were thinking might not be madness at all. And the difference between those two options was worse than either one alone. By the end of October 1962, Newsom had contacted every archive and historical society he could reach. The Kentucky Historical Society, the Pikeville Public Library's local records, the Floyd County Courthouse, the University of Kentucky's special collections. He was looking for records of the Upper Trace Fork settlement, deeds, tax records, church rolls, census records. He found almost nothing. This was not unusual, he told Noah. Record-keeping in isolated mountain communities in the 19th century was irregular at best. Many families lived their entire lives without appearing in any official document. The 1880 census for Floyd County showed the Trace Fork watershed with a handful of households listed vaguely by location, and then in the 1890 census, the same locations simply absent, not marked as moved or deceased, just absent, as if the census taker had looked at his map and found nothing there worth noting. The 1870 census had more. 4 households listed in the upper watershed, with the family name Caudle appearing twice, and 2 other names that Newsom couldn't fully read due to a water stain on the microfilm. Total persons, 23. 23 people. In the last census before the flood. Newsom calculated it. 4 families, maybe 5 children per family on average. That was roughly right for the period, for this region. 23 people in the hollow. 23 people who left in 1879 with what they could carry, with nothing else, with the hollow closing behind them, under 12 feet of silt. Where did they go? He asked Liddy. She was on her porch again, in November now, frost on the ground, wearing her heavy coat and watching the creek. Scattered, she said. That's what happened to people when a flood took their home. They went to relatives, to other hollows. My grandmother said one of the Caudle families went to Magoffin County. The others, she didn't know. She rocked. People in those days didn't leave forwarding addresses, but they survived. Oh yes, they were alive, they just didn't have anything. She paused. My grandmother said the worst part for them wasn't the flood. It was after. When the silt dried and you could walk up toward where the hollow had been and you could see nothing. Just a flat, gray field where the hollow had been. Nothing left above the surface, everything buried. All the work they'd done, all the building, the clearing, the planting. Gone. 12 feet down. She looked at the creek. She said one of the Caudle men, he walked up there every year for a long time just to stand at the edge of where it had been. Not to do anything, just to stand there. She paused again. People need to be able to point to a place, she said, even when the place is gone. Newsom drove home and wrote everything down and then sat at his kitchen table in Pikeville, surrounded by antiques he'd bought from 100 different hollows, and thought about 23 people standing at the edge of what had been their home, pointing at silt, pointing at nothing, unable to do anything about the arithmetic. 12 feet down, everything, all of it, irretrievable. He thought about the warm water. He thought about the hum. He thought about the objects spanning 1840 to 1920. A full 80 years of domestic life. 40 years of it post-dating the burial. He'd been pulling at this for months, trying to find the angle that made it rational. Erosion releasing objects sequentially, with the newest objects nearest the surface. Possible. Adjacent structures from after the burial from other families who'd built near the old site. Possible, barely. Objects from other locations in the watershed deposited in the same silt layer by subsequent floods. Possible, but increasingly strained. All of it was possible. None of it fit the warmth or the hum or the fact that Randall had seen a table still set under 5 feet of water, the cups in their places, the cloth still holding the outline of its original fold. 83 years since anyone had last touched it. He thought about a community of 23 people buried under silt in 1879. He thought about what it might mean if the burial had not been entirely straightforward. If the silt had enclosed not just the physical objects, but some quality, some property of the life that had been lived among them. Something that the objects carried the way iron carries heat, slowly, deeply, persistently. If time in an enclosed space with no input, no disruption, no ongoing history to interrupt it, if time in such a space ran differently. He thought about the objects with dates after 1879. If the hollow was still generating objects, still producing the detritus of daily life, cups and spoons and shoes and jars of preserved herbs from inside the silt, then it wasn't a preserved settlement. It was a continuing one, still running, still accruing the material of living in a time that had come apart from the time above the silt, in a hollow that the flood had sealed not just physically, but... He stopped writing. He had been a historian for 20 years. He dealt in evidence, in records, in the material culture of the past. He did not speculate beyond what the evidence supported. He looked at the evidence, he picked up his pen and wrote, "The hollow may be intact." He stared at the sentence for a long time. Then he crossed out "maybe" and wrote "is." November. 12 objects on the barn shelf. Noah had moved a second plank across the sawhorse to accommodate them. He'd arranged them roughly in the order they'd arrived. The doll at the far left, the Bible beside it, the spectacles, the spoon, the shoe, the jar, the tin cup with its stamped bird, a second piece of fabric that had come down in late September, a section of a woman's dress, the color of dried roses, with a line of small pearl buttons still attached, the buttons as sound as the day they were sewn on, a porcelain knob that might have been from a cabinet door, a thimble, copper, worn thin on one side from use, 2 coins, the kind of copper cent that predated the Lincoln design, 1850s, a length of braided cord, the kind used for laces or ties, so tightly braided that the structure had survived when the individual fibers were nearly gone. 12 objects, each one impossible. Noah went to the barn every morning. He stood in front of the shelf the way Liddy's caudal man had stood at the edge of the silt field, not to do anything, just to point, just to know where it was. He thought about the families. 23 people who had owned these things, used these things, worn the dress, and read the Bible, and set the table with the plates Randall had seen in the creek bed, and perhaps drunk from cups like the tin cup on his shelf. He thought about their children whose shoes were on his shelf. He thought about whoever wore the spectacles. A woman probably, because the frames were delicate, the correction significant, and whoever had them had needed them for detail work, for reading or sewing or both. He thought about the careful hand that had ground those lenses, somewhere in the early years of the century, in a time when the hollow had been under silt for 20 years. Ground by whose hand? For whose eyes? He thought about that at night sometimes and could not find the bottom of it. December. 2 more objects. The flood before Christmas brought a key, a hand-forged iron key, the kind for a simple lever lock, heavy in the hand, the surface rough with old rust, but the structure sound. And a folded piece of paper in a state of extraordinary preservation, tucked inside the key as if the key had been put away with a note attached to it. The paper was fragile but legible, written in a different hand from the Bible. Smaller, faster, less careful. Behind the second step, left side. That was all. Noah unfolded the paper very carefully and read it and folded it back and put it in his pocket. He didn't tell Newsom about the paper for 6 weeks. He wasn't sure why. There was something about it that felt private. Not private to him, but private to someone, and he was the wrong person to be reading it. He told Dinah. She read it. She handed it back without saying anything. She stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment with her arms crossed and her hip listing left, looking at the key in his hand. Then she said, "Put it back, Noah. Dinah, all of it. Everything in that barn. Put it all back." He looked at her. "They are not for you," she said. "They are not for Ephraim Newsom either. They're not for anybody here. They're going somewhere. You're stopping them." He held the key. "You hear me?" she said. "Put everyone back." He didn't put them back. January 1963, 2 more objects. February 1, March 3. The collection on the barn shelf grew to 22 objects, and then 26, and then, by mid-April, 34. Newsom drove up every few weeks and documented each new arrival with the careful excitement of a man watching a seam open. That specific quality of obsession that looks from the outside like scholarship and is from the inside simply the inability to stop. He brought a camera. He photographed the objects. He sent photographs to colleagues at 3 universities, presenting it as an anonymized case study, flood artifact of unusual preservation quality in a limestone creek watershed. 2 colleagues responded with scholarly interest. One asked to visit. Newsom put him off. He was not ready to share this. He was not sure why. Some part of him understood that sharing it would change what it was, would turn it into something bounded and manageable, a puzzle to be solved by the right committee of experts. And he did not believe the puzzle was solvable by experts, and he did not believe it was right to try. He wrote that in his journal, and then crossed it out. He was a scholar. Solving puzzles was his work. This was his work. He drove up again in April. Noah was at the barn when he arrived, standing in front of the shelf. He was standing the way Newsom had seen him stand before, not doing anything, just looking. But something was different this time. Newsom stood in the barn doorway and looked past Noah at the shelf and counted. "There are 31 objects," he said. Noah didn't turn around. "Yes." "There should be 34. "Yes." Newsom looked at the gaps on the shelf, 2 near the left end, where the oldest objects should have been, and 1 in the middle. 3 gaps. He looked at them for a moment. "Did you move them?" "No," Noah said. "Then where?" "Check the creek." Newsom checked the creek. He walked down to the lower bank, to the trot line bend, and looked at the water. The creek was low that morning, and it barely a foot above its summer line, and the current was slow. In the slow water below the limestone shelf, caught where the current eddied and deposited things, he saw them. The doll, face down in the shallows, half out of the water, its cotton dress moving in the current. The Bible open, pages fanning in the slow water. The copper thimble, barely visible in the gravel. He stood on the bank and looked at them. The objects he had dated, authenticated, written about, photographed, returning, going back into the creek, going back. He looked at the doll. It was 10 feet from where Noah had found it 2 years ago. The button eyes were above the water surface, catching the morning light. He did not wade in to get them. He stood on the bank for a long time. He thought about the table in the creek bed 12 miles upstream, still set, still waiting. He thought about 23 people in an 1880 census that went to silence in the 1890 version. He thought about time in an enclosed space, a buried space, a space sealed in silt in 1879, and perhaps still occupied, still running, still generating the daily evidence of a life being lived, releasing that evidence upstream and sending it downstream to a man who collected it, and when he collected it, recalling it, like a letter that demands to be forwarded, like a message that had an address, and the address was not him. He went back to the barn. "Noah," he said. Noah turned around. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had been holding something heavy for a long time and was deciding whether to set it down. "She was right," he said. Newsom didn't ask which she. "I'm going to put them back," Noah said. He did it in the morning 2 days later in April, on a dry day when the creek was low. Dinah came with him. She didn't offer to carry anything. Her hip was bad that season, worse than usual, but she walked down to the bank beside him and stood there while he made the trips back and forth from the barn. He didn't throw them in. He waded into his shins, the cold gripping him above his boots, and he set each object in the current, individually, carefully. The doll first. He held it at the water's surface and let the current take it, and it moved downstream slowly, turning once, and was gone around the bend. The Bible next. He opened it to the family record page, the names and years, before he let it go. He watched it move downstream, pages fanning in the current, and then it was around the bend and out of sight. The spectacles, the spoon, the shoe, each one a separate moment, a separate release. 31 objects in an hour. The creek ran around his shins, and the cold worked its way up through his boots, and the morning light was flat and direct from the east, and the water carried everything away. He set down the mason jar with its beeswax seal and watched the current take it, rolling it gently over the limestone shelf. He set down the tin cup with its stamped bird and watched it go. The key, he held the key for a moment, thinking about the note that had been folded inside it. Behind the second step, left side, he thought about someone putting that key away with that note attached, deliberately, carefully, assuming they'd come back for whatever was behind the second step on the left. He put the key in the water and let go. He waded back to the bank. Dinah was sitting on a flat rock a few feet up from the water. She hadn't said anything during the whole hour. She looked at him now. "Feel better?" she said. He thought about it. "No," he said. She nodded. That was the right answer. He sat down on the bank beside her, his wet boots sending up a small cold smell, and they both looked at the water. The creek ran. It ran the same way it had always run, the same way it would run tomorrow, the same mild April current over the same limestone shelf. There was nothing on the water to see. Everything was gone. They sat there for a while. 2 months. No objects. May was dry. The creek ran low and quiet, and Noah went down to the trot line bend every morning and found nothing. June was the same. He checked and found nothing but the normal summer creek. Clear water over shale. A few crawfish working the edge of the limestone shelf. A water snake moving in the lee of the far bank. Normal. He told himself it was normal. He told himself he was relieved. He was relieved. He was also waiting. He didn't stop going to the bank in the morning. He didn't stop looking. He told Dinah he was checking the trot line. She said, "I know," in the tone she used when what she meant was that she knew he was lying, but the lie was harmless. He went every morning. He called Newsom in late June. "Nothing," he said. 2 months, Newsom said. 2 months. A pause. "Maybe that's—" Newsom started. "Don't," Noah said. "All right. July, nothing. August, nothing." The creek ran its summer level, and the summer heat pressed down on the hollow, and the days were long and still, and Noah came home from the morning checks and ate breakfast and went about his work and did not think about it, mostly. In the 3rd week of August, he walked down to the trot line bend in the early morning and found something at the edge of the water. He stood very still when he saw it. It was small, about 4 inches by 3 inches, dark, lying on the gravel just above the water line, deposited there sometime in the night, in the slight rise and fall of the creek that happened every night when the dew ran. He crouched down and picked it up. A tintype. The old kind, the image printed on a thin iron plate, blackened on the edges in the way that old tintypes blacken. He held it to the morning light. A family. 5 people standing in front of a cabin. The cabin behind them was a log structure with a porch, and behind the porch was the solid, dark shape of a mountain hollow, ridge rising steep on both sides, the trees dense and close. The family, a man in the center, broad through the shoulders, in a coat that was clearly his good coat. A woman beside him, slightly shorter, her hair pulled up under a bonnet. 3 children arranged in front of them, 2 girls and a boy, oldest about 12, youngest maybe 5. The 5-year-old had a slight blur to his face. Children that age rarely held still. The man was looking directly at the camera with the specific look of a man who has been told to look at the camera and has decided to take it seriously. The woman was almost smiling. The older girl was almost smiling. The boy was not smiling. The younger girl had her hand in her mother's hand, and you could feel, even in the flat gray scale of the old image, the small grip of that hand. They were standing in the hollow. Before the flood. Before the silt. In the hollow that was still there, was still there, was still... He turned the tin type over. On the back. In pencil, in a hand he didn't recognize. Not the careful hand of the Bible inscription, not the quick hand of the note. A third hand, deliberate and small, pressing hard enough that the pencil had left a slight groove in the metal. "We are still here." He read it twice, 3 times. He stood on the bank of Trace Fork Creek in the early morning with the creek running past him and those 4 words in his hand, and he read them until the words were just shapes, just pencil marks in an iron plate that had been in the creek or near the creek or somewhere between here and 12 miles upstream, where a hollow waited under silt and the silt hummed. He swallowed. He looked at the photograph for a long time. He did not put the tintype back. He carried it to the house and set it on the kitchen table and made coffee and sat with it until Dinah came in. She looked at it on the table. She looked at his face. She sat down across from him and picked up the photograph and held it to the window light. She looked at the family for a long time. She turned it over and read the back. She set it down. She didn't say anything for a while. Outside, the creek ran. The morning was warm, the hollow full of summer light, the maple tree in the yard making a small sound in the breeze. A normal morning. An ordinary kitchen. An ordinary house. On an ordinary creek in Floyd County, Kentucky. "Noah," she said finally. "Yes." She looked at the photograph on the table between them. "What do you say to that?" He looked at the photograph. The woman almost smiling. The older girl almost smiling. The boy who was not. The younger girl with her hand in her mother's hand. "Nothing," he said. "There's nothing to say to that." He was right about that. A Newsom came up in September and held the tintype for a long time without speaking. He had it dated later, the photographic process, the plate type, the case style. And it came back as consistent with the 1870s, probably between 1872 and 1880. The cabin in the background was consistent with the kind of structure that would have been built in that hollow in that period. The clothing was consistent. Everything was consistent. He could not explain the inscription. Pencil on iron, from the 1870s or thereabouts. That much he could say. The handwriting was from that era. Someone had written those 4 words on that plate at some point, in a hand that pressed deliberately enough to leave a groove. "We are still here." He wrote everything up in a document that he kept in a locked drawer in his office at Pikeville College for the rest of his teaching career. He showed it to no one. After he retired in 1981, he donated his papers to the university library under a restriction that held them closed for 25 years. The restriction expired. The document is in the collection. It is listed in the finding aid as Field Notes on Trace Fork Creek Artifact Phenomena, Floyd County, Kentucky, 1961 to 1963. Nobody has requested it in years. Noah kept the tintype. He kept it for the rest of his life. In the house, on the mantel in the front room, not in the barn. Dinah let it stay in the house, which was the only comment she ever made on the distinction between the tintype and the other objects. The other objects had been going somewhere. The tintype had arrived. It was different. He died in 1979, the same year as the original silt flood, which may be a coincidence. The creek came up that spring, the way it had in 1879, briefly, and deposited things on the lower bank, normal things that year, normal flood debris, and then receded. Normal. Dinah died in 1984. The tintype went to Randall. Randall Hall kept it until he was 62 when he gave it to his daughter. She keeps it now in a house in eastern Kentucky, not far from Trace Fork. She has asked him more than once what it is, and he has told her the whole story. She believes him. She is not sure what believing him means, except that she does not look at the photograph the same way she looks at other photographs. Trace Fork Creek still floods. It floods the way it always has, twice a year usually, more in wet years, and when it floods it deposits. After heavy rains in the spring, hikers who walk the lower banks have occasionally found things. A hand-carved comb, left on a flat rock above the waterline. Cedar, carved with small birds along the spine. A copper thimble worn thin on one side. Possibly the same thimble, possibly not. A section of braided cord, tight worked. The individual fibers nearly gone, but the structure intact. Small things. Objects from a domestic life. Objects that no one along the watershed can account for and that no estate or collection or record can be traced to. Nobody collects them anymore. The word got around, the way things get around in a country where people have long memories. They leave them where they find them, or they set them gently back at the water's edge, and the creek takes them, or doesn't, and the creek runs on. 14 miles upstream, in a hollow buried under silt since 1879, among objects still arranged on shelves and tables and in the positions where they were placed before the water came. There is an ongoing argument about whether any of this can be explained, and the argument takes place in silence and in warmth and in the low hum that Randall Hall felt through the hull of his kayak in October of 1962 and carried home in his chest for the rest of his life. A second heartbeat he could never quite account for. A rhythm just slightly out of phase with his own. The creek gives what it gives. It has been giving for 60 years. It will give tomorrow and in the spring and in every heavy rain that falls on the ridges above Floyd County for as long as the ridges stand. An entire community intact in the dark below the silt, with nowhere to be except where it is. Still here,